You are terrified, afraid, concerned about the dragon of something we can call communism, Marxism.
Am I terrified of it? Not
Well,
terrified enough to be
okay.
a tyrant.
Your theories had two components.
Yeah.
With
I'm not paralyzed.
Had a dragon.
Yeah, I'm not paralyzed, and I don't want to be a tyrant.
The tyrant part, I think, is missing with you. But
So
you are very concerned. The intensity of your feeling does not give much space, actually, at least in your public persona, for sitting quietly with the dragon and sipping in a couple of beers and thinking about this thing. The intensity of your anger, concern about certain things you're seeing in society, is that going to drive you off the path that ultimately takes us to a better world?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to get that right. So we've kind of come to a cultural conclusion about the Nazis. Do you get to be angry about the Nazis? Seems the answer to that is yes.
Well, actually, let me push back here. I also don't trust people who are angry about the Nazis. Because
I mean the actual Nazis.
Well, there's a lot, as you know, there's a lot of people in the world that use actual Nazis to mean a lot of things.
I know.
One of them is very important to me.
Me, for example.
Well, yes.
He's a Nazi, or magical super Nazi, as it turns out.
I think they actually sort of steel man all their perspectives. I think a lot of people that call you a Nazi mean it. So
yeah, I'm aware of that.
Jordan Peterson, always with the Nazis, and, as you will see, always with the devil. Let's watch the entire clip, and I'll provide commentary.
You are terrified, afraid, concerned about the dragon of something we can call communism, Marxism.
The host, Lex Friedman, who's of Jewish descent, thinks the dragon that Peterson is always talking about is the communist dragon, which it is, and if you'll recall, when Peterson responded, he tacitly admitted as much. Peterson is forever telling his followers that they must become heroes and slay the dragon of chaos, by which he mostly means the liberals and Jews, because to neo-Nazis like Peterson, modern-day liberals, including Jews, or who he brands the radical left, have become ideologically possessed by 20th century Marxism-Leninism. Behind the radical left's progressive veneer, there lurks a Stalinist ideology that's murderous.
I think it's absolutely reprehensible that the radical left dares to attribute to ethnically identified groups collective guilt. There's absolutely no excuse for that. It's completely murderous.
To avoid being murdered by the radical left, Peterson's legion of losers need to struggle through 12 rules for life, transform into heroes, and embark on a journey, one that's homicidal. As I've said before, Peterson is a domestic terrorist, a paramilitary figure who employs crypto-fascism to encourage his listeners to harm or kill people who he identifies as enemies, and this is not a claim I make lightly. His enemies are just about anyone who isn't a member of his cult. The more innocent, the better. Luckily, his target audience is literacy challenged, so deciphering his mumbo-jumbo is probably beyond their capacity. You might be interested to know that Peterson stole his radical leftist rhetoric from Hitler, who linked politically moderate Jews and Weimar Republic Democrats to the communists, which did include Jews. Hitler warned that this lot would undermine civilization itself, thereby turning Germany into a nation of puppets, pacifists, and cowards, which is what Peterson says about the reprehensible radical left. Hitler also wrote about, quote, the Marxists who were responsible for the murder of our people, end quote, and he twice referred to the communists as a dragon, although I doubt Lex Friedman knew that. The Nazis used images of dragons to signify communists and Jews. Take this propaganda poster, where we see the red dragon, like the one in the Book of Revelation, being skewered by the SS symbol. And here's a Nazi propaganda portrait of St. George slaying the dragon. Peterson has included images of St. George and the dragon in all 3 of his books. For example, this image from Beyond Order. As for the Petersonian hero who should do the dragon in, Peterson has called Hitler a hero, and boasted that he won a medal for heroism. Thus, Peterson's adherents need to become a Hitlerite hero. This is why Jordan Peterson recently informed Piers Morgan that everyone has more than a bit of Hitler in them, and why he's always telling people that they need to understand that, deep down, they are Nazis.
You know, in my classes, and I tell my students this right at the beginning, I'm trying to get them to understand why they are Nazis. Right, there isn't anything more unsafe than that. And all of them, virtually all of them, write back to me afterwards and say, this was the most worthwhile class I've ever had in my life, and it changed my life. It's like, well, I'm teaching you the worst possible thing about yourself. And your response is, oh, that was so useful, and I'm way better than I was. You know, but it's in keeping with the idea that you need to be exposed to things that you fear and hate, because that's where salvation lies, roughly speaking.
By realizing you're a Nazi, you'll achieve salvation. And Hitler, who Peterson has said saw himself as Germany's savior, wrote and spoke about salvation at least 50 times. He often spoke about the salvation of the German Volk and the salvation of the German nation. He also talked about salvation in ways Peterson has attempted to imitate. Compare the following quotes. Hitler, no salvation is possible until the bearer of disunion, the Jew, has been rendered powerless to harm. Peterson, there can be no salvation for one in the presence of the continued suffering of all. Hitler, the possibility of salvation in a better future. Peterson, the possibility of mutual salvation, or the closest you can manage here on earth. Hitler, to support a heroic man who, as a passionate patriot, sought to save his people from destruction, and who has gloriously achieved its salvation. Peterson, for this reason there have always been people who, not satisfied with the dominance of conscious life, set forth, under cover and by devious paths, to their destruction or salvation. Hitler, the Almighty himself is creating, out of his own merciful will, the prerequisite for the salvation of our Volk. Peterson, Christ died on the cross for the salvation of mankind. Hitler, from Germany, the light should come which is destined to light both Germany and the world to their salvation. Peterson, and he will, in that manner, bring salvation to the ever-desperate world. Getting back to the Friedman interview, is JP terrified of the communist dragon?
Am I terrified of it? Not
Well,
terrified
okay,
enough to
okay.
be a tyrant.
Your theories had two components.
Yeah.
What's-
I'm not paralyzed.
It had a dragon.
Yeah, I'm not
Okay.
paralyzed, and I don't want to be a tyrant.
The tyrant part, I think, is missing with you.
Lots of parts are missing with Peterson, but not the tyrant part. Recall how he said he's not paralyzed by the communist dragon, and consider what Hitler wrote about the communist dragon in Mein Kampf. I stood dumbfounded for almost 2 hours, watching that enormous human dragon, which slowly uncoiled before me. When I finally left the square and wandered in the direction of my lodgings, I felt dismayed and depressed. Upon seeing the communist dragon, Hitler was dumbfounded, dismayed, and depressed. Why, it seems he was virtually paralyzed. However, he emerged from his paralysis and, to quote Peterson, climbed the ranks of the hierarchy in a remarkable manner. Once at the apex, he instructed his acolytes to bring order to chaos by going on a hero's journey and slaying the dragon. And in 12 Rules for Life, Peterson writes, "You see the gold the dragon hoards. Instead of shrinking in terror from the all-too-real fact of the dragon, you step forward to take your place in the dominance hierarchy and occupy your territory, manifesting your willingness to defend, expand, and transform it." As for the gold the dragon hoards, Peterson has shown his students a propaganda film called The Eternal Jew. Here's a clip taken from his lecture.
For the Jew, there's but one thing of value: money. How he gets it makes no difference.
As I've said before, Peterson teaches about Nazi propaganda techniques and then practices them. Hitler spoke about the Jewish capitalist craze for gold. In Peterson's Eternal Jew lecture, he said that the Jews are at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. Hitler's at the top, the Jews are at the bottom, and Peterson's followers need to take their place in the hierarchy and occupy their territory. They also need to climb through the ranks, like Hitler did. Peterson's dominance hierarchy is a metaphor for the Fourth Reich, as well as a stand-in for the sort of racial hierarchy written about by the Nazis. Peterson has spoken about the Nazis' Aryan domain of purity. Note how domain of purity sounds a little bit like dominance hierarchy.
The tyrant part, I think, is missing with you. But
So
you are very concerned. The intensity of your feeling does not give much space, actually, at least in your public persona, for sitting quietly with the dragon and sipping in a couple of beers and thinking about this thing. The intensity of your anger, concern about certain things you're seeing in society, is that going to drive you off the path that ultimately takes us to a better world?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to get that right. So we've kind of come to a cultural conclusion about the Nazis.
So, JP, do you think your anger might interfere with your career as a public intellectual? Well, I'm trying to get that right, and we've kind of come to a cultural conclusion about the Nazis. Kind of? Apart from habitually linking himself to Nazism, Peterson is fond of making ambiguous remarks about his guiding ideology.
Were the operations undertaken by the fascist physicians who carried out the Nazi medical experiments legal? Yes, under the laws of the time. But were they criminal? I'll leave that question up to you to answer.
Peterson was directing his message to adherents for whom the answer would be no, the Nazi experiments were not criminal. And here's another example of Peterson serving up some Nazi-themed ambiguous speech while seated next to a statuette of St. George slaying the dragon. He'll begin by saying the Columbine killers were motivated by Satan before posing a question about the Nuremberg trial verdicts.
Well, they're motivated by something. Well, what? Well, it's something satanic from an archetypal perspective. So for me, what ended up at the bottom of reality was it's wrong to inflict unnecessary pain. So pain even that doesn't serve your own purposes even. That's the Nuremberg judgment, fundamentally. It's like there are things that are wrong. Okay, are you going to accept that or not? Well, if you accept that, there's a place you go. And if you don't accept that, there's another place you go.
The other place you go is hell, where Satan reigns. And the story of Milton's Satan, who fell into hell after rebelling against the Jewish God in heaven, is always running around in Peterson's mind.
What Milton did was to collect a myth that had formed around the central core of Christianity and to give it a more or less formal structure. And the myth is the notion that there was a rebellion in heaven and that the devil fell, who was God's highest angel, one of his two sons, I guess, the other one being Christ, Satan being the oldest son, rebelled against God in an attempt to occupy his position and was cast into hell. Oh, it's a story that has always run around in my mind for some peculiar reason. Lucifer means light bringer.
Let's return to Peterson trying to enlighten his fans and Lex Friedman through the medium of ambiguous speech.
Do you get to be angry about the Nazis? Seems the answer to that is yes.
When he said, in his best Albertan redneckese, "Do you get to be angry about the Nazis?" he meant angry about how the Nazis lost. Of course, he knew the question would be widely interpreted as angry about the atrocities the Nazis committed, hence why he said, it seems the answer to the question is yes. It seems. In other words, the verdict on the Nazis is still out, like with the Nuremberg trial judgments and the Nazi experiments.
Well, actually, let me push back here. I also don't trust people who are angry about the Nazis. Because
I mean the actual Nazis.
Well, there's a lot, as you know, there's a lot of people in the world that use actual Nazis to mean a lot of things.
I know.
One of them is very important to me.
Me, for example.
Well,
Yes.
well,
He's a Nazi,
I think,
or magical super Nazi, as it turns out.
I think they actually sort of steel man all their perspectives. I think a lot of people that call you a Nazi mean it. So
yeah, I'm aware of that.
There's an important thing there, though, because I went to the front in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people that lost their home or that got to interact a lot with the Russian soldiers, Ukrainian people that interact with the Russian soldiers, they reported that the Russian soldiers really believe they're saving the people of Ukraine in these local villages from the Nazis.
I understand, yeah.
So to them, it's not just that the Ukrainian government has, or Ukraine has some Nazis. It's like it has been, the idea is that the Nazis have taken over Ukraine and we need to free them. This is the belief.
Yeah.
So this, again, Nazi is still a dragon that lives.
Yeah.
And it's used by people because it's safe to sit next to that dragon and spread any kind of ideology you want. So I just want to kind of say that we have agreed on the
Believe it or not, this is a conversation between two PhD holders. Peterson didn't have to connect himself to Nazism, but, once again, he did. He loves to joke about how Marvel Comics likened him to a magical super-Nazi, even though he's expressed outrage at the comparison, and when he does joke, his humor is meant for an audience of one. As I document in my book, The Devil and His Due, Peterson thinks he really is a magical super-Nazi. That is, he believes he has magical powers. For example, the power to manipulate people through speech. I should add that Peterson has suggested that Hitler was a black magician who is versed in the power of suggestion and used his magical speech to turn the Germans into Nazis. Peterson has even given a demonstration of Hitler's magical speech, wherein he played the role of Hitler. Of course, Peterson's ability to manipulate people does not come from magic, but deception. And far from being a possessor of superhuman powers, he's possessed by schizophrenia, which can include what's known as magical thinking, a phenomenon researchers have linked to auditory hallucinations, which Peterson admitted he had when he descended into schizophrenia, as he documents in Maps of Meaning. As for Lex Friedman, what he appears to be saying is that there are no Nazis. Therefore, critics who call Peterson a Nazi and mean it are not to be trusted. His logic seems to be that since Putin falsely claims the Ukrainians are Nazis, and since other people, that is, liberals, level equally ludicrous charges, Nazis do not exist. As I keep saying, this is a widespread belief that spans the political spectrum. It's internalized and reformulated by people who appear to have been schooled by Google, and it often comes from this meme, which says, "Everyone I don't like is Hitler, a child's guide to online political discussion." You see, nowadays, you don't need to think. There are memes that will do that for you. Listen as Lex Friedman says he doesn't believe anyone who says someone is a Nazi.
But I still don't trust anybody who uses that
Yeah,
one.
but we have issues with boundaries, right? No, it's... So this is a very complicated problem, right?
Yeah.
So René Girard believed that it was a human proclivity to demonize the scapegoat and then drive it out of the village. And I've thought about that a lot. We need a place to put Satan.
René Girard explains the Nietzschean origin of the scapegoat mechanism utilized by the Nazis in a book called I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. Peterson's scapegoat, demonized and driven out of the village, was a furtive reference to the Jews, demonized and driven out of the Third Reich. In addition to calling the Jews chaos, think of Peterson's Dragon of Chaos, Hitler branded the Jews the devil and said of them, "Send back to Lucifer him who would assault the heavens." Of course, Hitler was gaslighting. He was the devil, or so Peterson believes. Peterson has called Hitler the devil, Lucifer, and satanically possessed. Interestingly, Hitler laced his language with references to the devil, underlined passages in an occultic book about the devil, misquoted a famous book about the devil, that is, Goethe's Faust, and spoke of himself as the devil as represented in Milton's Paradise Lost, at least according to biographer John Toland, who writes, Hitler was delightfully taken by surprise at being asked for a tete-a-tete by Neville Chamberlain, and described his feelings with a colorful idiom that would have perplexed Milton. "I fell from heaven." Now compare the following quotes. Hitler, "By seeking his own happiness, man veritably tumbles out of heaven and falls into hell." Peterson, "Lucifer is flung from heaven into hell, because such elevation, such rebellion against the highest and incomprehensible, inevitably produces hell." Circling back to the idea of a scapegoat, in Maps of Meaning, Peterson includes a letter from his best friend, which mentions a scapegoat in conjunction with Hitler. It reads, "Obviously, if I am determined to overlook my own part in the failure to resolve my own frustrations, if I am determined to find a scapegoat for my problems, then I am just a stone's throw away from the mentality that was responsible for Hitler's final solution." The letter goes on to say, As I wrote that last paragraph, I was suddenly reminded of your idea that the devil, as he is represented in Milton's Paradise Lost, is a metaphor for the rational intellect, placed in the position of the highest psychic authority, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven.
As I wrote that last paragraph, I was suddenly reminded of your idea that the devil, as he is represented in Milton's Paradise Lost, is a metaphor for the rational intellect, which is being placed in the position of the highest psychic authority. Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven.
Peterson's friend admitted that he was thinking of finding a scapegoat for his own inadequacies, and that by doing so he was approaching Nazism. And then he effectively praised Satan by labeling him a metaphor for the rational intellect and the highest psychic authority. This is interesting because Peterson has said that his best friend, who committed suicide, was, like Hitler, possessed, psychotic, murderous, and suffered from insanity. He has also said that his best friend offed himself after going down the bad path and encountering the devil. Why is Peterson always going on about the Nazis and the devil? Basically, he's a Nazi and a Satanist. It's more common than you might think. Heinrich Himmler was a Satanist, and Hitler's underlining passages about Satan in a book about the occult suggests a Luciferian interest. The Hells Angels are often Nazis and Satanists, and in Maps of Meaning, Peterson writes about meeting one of them. My landlord was a powerful, aging ex-biker, former president of the local Hells Angels chapter, by his own account, who had spent some time in prison as a younger man. Why would Peterson write about a powerful Hells Angels man in a book he claims is about the Holocaust? And why would he write about the man again in 12 Rules for Life, some 17 years later? Because he's obsessed with such men, rough, tough, muscular, thuggish, and demonic men. That's why he shows pictures of Wehrmacht soldiers marching about in jackboots while raving about how perfect they look and how Hitler's ideology was so unbelievably attractive. It's why he visited a boxing club in the UK and had a chat with some of the rough and troubled men. It's why he includes pictures in his books of Michelangelo's Sinewy David, a ripped Mephistopheles flying over Germany, and the hulking child rapist and child murderer, Karl Panzram. It's why he wrote the following in Maps of Meaning about visiting a maximum security penitentiary. Soon I was surrounded by men, some of whom were extremely large and tough-looking. One in particular stands out in my memory. He was exceptionally muscular and tattooed over his bare chest. He had a vicious scar running down the middle of his body, from his collarbone to his midsection. Maybe he had survived open heart surgery, or maybe it was an axe wound. The injury would have killed a lesser man anyway, someone like me. Peterson was the lesser man, and the convicted criminal the greater man. Especially great was his muscular bare chest. We shouldn't be surprised. Hitler made homoerotic comments about his soldiers and boys in the Hitler Youth. Peterson loves, and is searching for, demonic males. Indeed, in 12 Rules, he cites a book called Demonic Males, Apes and the Origin of Human Violence. And speaking of demonic males, let's return to Peterson talking about the need to find a place for Satan.
I've thought about that a lot. We need a place to put Satan. Like, seriously, this is a serious issue.
Should he be inside the village or outside?
Well, maybe he should be inside you. Right? That's the fundamental essence of the Christian doctrine. It's like Satan is best fought on the battleground of your soul. And that's right. It's right.
Hold on. Is Peterson implying that Satan is in his soul? Is he channeling that In Excess song that says that every single one of us has a devil inside? In part, yes. And when Peterson refers to Satan, he's simultaneously alluding to Hitler and himself. The picture I just showed you of Satan plummeting into hell was commissioned by him, and with his black curly hair, Satan sort of looks like him when he was younger. Of course, it isn't Beelzebub that's inside Peterson, it's schizophrenia. He's gravely mentally ill, and the evidence suggests he has been since he was a child. With that in mind, one of the trickier aspects of deciphering his crypto-fascism involves knowing that some words, such as Satan, have multiple and contradictory meanings. For instance, Satan also means Jews. The primary dictionary, as it were, for Peterson's esoteric language can be found in the speeches and writings of Adolf Hitler, who spoke of the satanic malice of the Jews and wrote that, under the Marxist cloak of purely social concepts, there are hidden aims which are of a satanic character. This is essentially what Peterson says about the murderous radical left. Now, compare the following statements about war and Satan. Peterson, Satan is best fought on the battleground of your soul. Hitler, for 3 years we have waged war, often against death and devil, but always only for our German fatherland. When Jordan Peterson said to Lex Friedman that Satan is best fought on the battleground of your soul, what he probably meant was, Satan is best fought on the battleground of your soul, you Jew. He was likely telling Friedman that he was Satan, and that Satan needs to be put somewhere. For example, in one of the concentration camps Peterson is always saying he could work at as a Nazi guard with happiness. If no one understood, Peterson wouldn't care, because to his way of thinking, he would have been keeping the faith and venerating his spiritual master, Adolf Hitler. To be sure, he has repeatedly made covert references to Nazism when speaking to Jews and non-whites, as he did in this interview with a host from the Netherlands.
So, but basically what you're saying is that when you have these dark thoughts in your mind, in the back of your mind, you kind of tap into the collective unconscious of the culture you're embedded in.
Definitely, definitely. There's no doubt about it, is that like the dark part of me and the dark part of you is the same thing in some ways, you know, and we live in the same culture. And so it's going to manifest itself in a similar manner.
Yeah.
The dark part of you was almost certainly meant to signify the host's skin color. Satan is also inside of him, and we need a place to put Satan. You're taking him out of context, Peterson's fans would say, even though just seconds before he criticized Antifa. He also clandestinely depicted himself as Hitler while slamming The Guardian for their unfavorable coverage.
So here's the strange thing, eh? So I kind of played, let's say, knight on white horse. And so The Guardian yesterday published a astoundingly reprehensible article.
He kind of played knight on white horse. How intriguing, because he's always going on about how Hitler was the knight on the white horse.
Well, that's all propaganda for Hitler. And look at the imagery, you know. He's a knight, that's on the right. He's the knight of nationalism. Well, that's God the Father too, you know. More mythological representations, I like these quite a bit. So there's there Hitler as, you know, knight of the faith, essentially, with, right? So that's kind of interesting, but that's Hitler as knight of the blood. Oh yeah, he's a knight. He's a white knight, in fact. Yeah, so he's assimilated to the idea of medieval nobility, you know, and in its purest form, he's a knight of the people. So I kind of played, let's say, knight on white horse.
After Peterson spoke about playing the knight on the white horse, or the hero, the host asked him to explain the hero's myth.
What is the archetypical hero's myth? What makes it archetypical? And what is a hero? Could you elaborate on this?
Well, imagine that you have a problem, and then imagine that you want a solution. And imagine that there's a particular solution to that particular problem.
Gosh, given that he's repeatedly said that all his work is predicated on atrocities, like the ones committed during the Holocaust, I wonder what the problem and solution could be. To find the answer, we can go to the beginning of the oldest lecture Peterson has published, part 1 of his Maps of Meaning series.
And so I'll start the introduction now. Okay. This is a course about the causes of social conflict.
Observe how above the phrase, the Holocaust, it says, the nature of the problem. This is cryptofascism, a surreptitious reference to the Jewish problem, the one that requires a solution. Hitler also spoke about the nature of the problem, so Peterson was practicing cryptofascism by plagiarizing Hitler, which he has done across his 3 books over 3,100 times. But as to the archetypal hero who needs to find a solution to the problem, it's the hero in Milton's Paradise Lost. It's Satan. Mind, Satan is inside of Jews, non-whites, and Peterson's ever-expanding list of enemies. But that's fine, because to combat Satan, you need to be Satan. This is why Peterson is forever urging his rough young men to channel the Jungian self, an archetype comprised of Christ and the Antichrist, along with the Jungian shadow, which Jung associated with the devil and Hitler. To learn more, please read The Devil and His Due: How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share. The devil inside, the devil inside. Every single one of us is a devil inside. The devil inside, the devil inside. Every single one of us is a devil inside.